Time for another video, and before we get started, a big thank you and shout out once again to everyone who has liked and subscribed so far. This is a channel dedicated to helping others improve as artists in the most efficient manner possible by leveraging the research of neuroscience, meta-learning, and autodidacticism. I recently passed 300 hours of trying to improve my painting and drawing skills by experimenting with spaced repetition learning. Practice for just 1 hour a day with the area of study dictated by an algorithm that tells me what to work on, using flashcards I made from popular art books. You can see a little of each day's training session in my shorts feed, where I post every day, including a short description. If you would like to learn more about this system and how it can help you, I have a video on screen now. The flashcards I have captured for this experiment are all captured from books, which you can view in this video. This is not my first 300 hours of drawing as a total beginner, but most of my previous experience was with copying other drawings. I started out copying anime as a teen and got so frustrated at not being able to draw it from imagination, despite all the hours spent copying, that I started learning again from scratch. I also decided to learn to paint, and I am learning that as a total beginner. Let's start with what I learned about painting over these last 100 hours. If you want to skip to the drawing part, you can use the timestamps in the description to do so. Last time, you may remember, I had decided I wanted to learn more about colour and light and enhance my rendering skills. A few more issues were raised with regards to this when I repainted some images that I use as a baseline to test my skill every 200 hours. Trying to learn how to use the brushes and their settings in Photoshop to get some nice looking finishes, and it's starting to make more sense, but more importantly, I've been looking at ways to convincingly depict light and shadow and use values to depict the form of the objects I paint. This has been easy enough to do when working from references, because I can just pick 3 or perhaps 5 values I can see and decide which part of the image falls within which value group. The hardest part about this is working out what a colour looks like translated to a value. But what about when you want to work from imagination and paint something with no reference? How do you make the values and lighting look realistic? Well, to do this, I've been using another book from Scott Robertson called How to Render, and in particular a fantastic guideline mentioned in the book called the halfway to black rule. The idea is very simple. Let's say we are working in Photoshop and we have a white cube with a value of 90. The sides that are in shadow will have a value of around 45. If we make this value lighter than 45, we can make the lighting for the scene seem a lot softer, diffused and brighter, as if the light is bouncing around and filling in all of the shadow side. If we make it darker than 45, then we can make the painting feel like the light is bright and directional, but only coming from one side, like a harsh spotlight. The neat thing about this as a concept is that it works for all values in the painting. For example, a painting with a box on a floor and a stripe or pattern running across that floor can be handled in an identical fashion. Where the shadow overlaps the dark stripe, we just cut its value by 50% and we have shadows that feel convincing. We could manage this using a multiply layer, and that's probably how most of you go about doing this when painting digitally, but I feel we often just accept things like using a layer trick without really understanding why it works or why we do it. The halfway to black rule, or 50% rule if you prefer, is what your multiply layers are trying to replicate. This is a great guideline to bear in mind for when painting digitally without any layer tricks, just working in pure paint on a single layer, or when painting traditionally. Now, I've actually checked these values in real life photos and it rarely comes out as a clean 50% reduction. That's because there are a few other things that we have to account for, like bounce light and ambient occlusion, but as a general rule of thumb or a starting point for a painting, the 50% rule is really good and easy to remember. You can use it to quickly get believable results when painting from imagination. You can also make it work with traditional materials. If we have something like alcohol markers with values assigned to them, as we tend to get in grey marker sets, it's quite easy to do. We can also carefully mix our paints so that the values shift by about 50%, remembering that paints such as gouache change value as they dry. To make things even more realistic, there are a couple of other things that you can include which I spotted when I started comparing photos to the way that Scott Robertson renders. Firstly, there are very rarely planes that exhibit one flat value. Generally the value is changing across the face, if only slightly, and we can recreate this with either the gradient tool or using a soft brush. Traditionally, we can just vary the pressure, or use an airbrush, or erase some of the material we put down, such as when we work with tools like charcoal. This gradation can sometimes be predicted or follow certain rules, which is handy for when working from imagination. For example, where two planes meet, it will often be darker on the plane moving towards where it meets another plane. so we can make the gradient darker in this direction. There may even be a little bit of ambient occlusion, a very dark part where the light is bouncing around far less at the point where the planes are joined. This is also very commonly found in areas where one object sits on a surface. However, we can also see the opposite sometimes. If a light is directly aiming at a plane, then it will likely bounce some light off onto any planes that adjoin it. And we can generally recreate this bounce light by making the value 10% lighter and using either the gradient tool or a soft brush to add it. Every instance of this you see when working from reference is going to be slightly different and specific to that scene, but these are general guidelines I'm describing that you can quickly add to a painting from your imagination to bump up the realism slightly should you wish to. Just make sure you bear the lighting in mind, as this will determine whether one is the correct choice or the other. Once you learn to see these things and their nuances, then you can look for them when painting simple compositions like still lifes, and begin to add them to your own simple imaginary still life compositions. There are a few other things I've been playing with, mostly with traditional media, and one of those things is texture. A lot of the artists I admire when working traditionally, like Emma Block, are capable of creating very appealing paintings by carefully placing textured marks on their work. I've found this to be a bit hit and miss when trying it myself, as the marks I seem to make do not appear at all like the ones I see in the work of the artists I admire. I've been spending a fair bit of time trying to replicate these marks by experimenting with different brushes and papers, and paint consistencies, and the amount of paint I have on the brush. So far, I get the best results, as in most similar to the marks I admire, when using a very, very low amount of paint and gradually building this texture up. When combined with a paint colour and tone that is contrasting, like a shadow or highlight colour, this is a really fun way to paint, and I am enjoying testing it out. The possibilities here are endless, and I feel that finding some way to use this that appeals to you personally in your paintings is a good way to develop a bit of personal style and add some visual flair to your paintings, like fingerprints that are unique to you. Another thing I am still playing with a lot is colour, and while I did intend to study this a lot more deeply, especially in my digital work over the last 100 hours, most of the work I have done with this has been traditional. I find that colour is far easier to learn traditionally because you only have a few simple paint colours to choose from and are responsible for physically mixing your own desired colours. You have to think about things like how you're changing the value while trying to make the paint perhaps warmer or less saturated as you attempt to mix the colours you want. When working digitally, however, we have all the colours we could ever want at our fingertips, and this makes the painting faster, and we can quickly play with things like swapping or adjusting the colours. This is an advantage when experimenting, but I feel that the practical colour mixing experience is lost, and I feel this is detrimental to learning about colour. As a result, I currently favour a traditional approach when learning how colour works. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Do those of you who have experimented with painting digital and traditional art feel that you made more progress with regards to your understanding of colour with one method more than the other? The most important thing that has jumped out at me really over the last 100 hours for this is how colour and light are really all just about contrast. When we work with colour, we're still using value, and that means that we have to make our colours lighter or darker. When doing this, we have additional levers that we can pull, like temperature and saturation, and it's by keeping these quite close or pushing them really far apart that we can simulate different lighting situations and invoke different moods. My 200-hour repaints threw up a lot of issues with my understanding of colour, so I'll definitely keep working on that for the next 100 hours, and also get more practice rendering digitally. Let's talk about drawing now. Last time you saw me, I was feeling a little lost with a couple of things in my drawing of anatomy. The first was the fact that the primitive forms I was using to represent body parts like boxes work well for placing the figure in 3D space, but don't look particularly anatomical. I'm pleased to say that as I progress through the Tom Fox book, he literally addresses this by hacking off chunks of these boxes, gradually making the forms more planar. Even with just a few planes on the ribcage, head and pelvis, it makes a huge jump up in realism, and I'm excited to see how this gets further and further refined as I progress. One area that is a little strange when learning like this, however, is the abdomen. It's generally depicted as a cylinder, but when you look at reference poses, there are times when it gets squished up inside the ribcage and pelvis, and it really isn't much of a cylinder at all. It's been a huge help to really consider how and why body parts like the ribcage are shaped the way they are, to make room for the organs and to protect them. And the book also goes into this. It seems inconsequential, but this knowledge has made me really think about the forms I draw, I suppose because the form follows the function, as they say. Another issue that has cropped up though is that of curvature, and I've had a few people mention in the comments that my head drawings in particular do not take into account the curvature of the skull enough. They are correct, and this was not something I was considering, and it's thrown up an interesting dichotomy in approaches when learning to draw the head. You see, when I started trying to learn anatomy from Loomis some time ago, I used to copy the infamous Loomis head. And the great thing about this approach to drawing heads is that it really emphasizes this curvature, which affects things like the eyebrows wrapping around the skull. I tried to draw this without the book though. I failed because I had no clue how perspective worked at the time, or how to proportion the head. I was just copying for the sake of copying and assuming that this would magically translate into artistic ability. When I learned perspective and then the Tom Fox more box-based approach, it was great. I could draw a box at whatever angle I wanted and subdivide it and then plot the features on it. But it's a box, and a box has no curves. Tom does address this issue later in the book, but you can hopefully see how two different artists who each learned one approach would take very different paths in learning to construct the head. I'd love to know if anyone watching has a preferred method. Do you draw heads using the Loomis method and focus on curvature, or do you think in terms of boxes and focus more on perspective initially? Perhaps you know some combined box curve method that you've seen somewhere which might make drawing heads easier for other artists. As a result, I've decided I'm going to be revisiting the Loomis method over the next 100 hours to see what difference it makes to the way I draw heads both from reference and from imagination, and if I can introduce more curvature to my drawings in general. The other issue I was playing with last time was this uncanny ability that artists like Kim Jung-gi have to draw the things they imagine as silhouettes with no construction guidelines. This has been a much harder issue to contend with, but I feel as if my line quality has improved somewhat over the last 100 hours. It seems to have made my ability to sketch from reference sharper. I can map the silhouettes and generally draw them as single bold lines and get them pretty accurate, but doing this from imagination is still a little bit more difficult. It results in more shaky lines, less confident marks, weird perspective, and wonky drawings. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why this is again and think that it must boil down to one of a few things. First is me not having enough knowledge of what I am drawing to really visualize it well enough. We could consider this an insufficient knowledge of anatomy, which I do indeed have, but I'm still trying to draw fairly simple figures here, not realistic complex ones just yet. The second is a general lack of ability to visualize things. That is, I cannot see things in my mind's eye well enough to draw them. And the third is that I might be able to see things in my mind and understand them, but my hand might not be able to execute the lines accurately enough, making this an issue with things like proprioception or motor skills. The thing that interests me most about this issue though, is that if I attempt this imaginary silhouette technique with things I am highly familiar with, like cubes or cylinders, then I can draw them as silhouettes, in perspective, just like Kim Jung-gi would, more or less. But a human head or a full human figure? Not so much. So why is it that I seem to possess this ability for drawing simple things, but not more complex ones? One commenter had something very interesting to say about this and mentioned that Kim Jung-gi supposedly did not visualize that much of his drawings beforehand, but instead, and this is profound, allowed each line he placed to dictate where the next line would go. If you really stop and think about that for a second, it actually totally changes the way that we interpret Kim Jung-gi's drawings. I assume, as you may do, that he is tracing an imaginary outline. He's perfectly tracing this thing he sees in his head, let's say to within 80% accuracy. But what if, instead, he actually just had an idea for a pose in general, and the final form was dictated line by line? So he doesn't so much visualize it in detail, but build it up based on what his hand puts down. The final image forms based on the perspective and position suggested by the previous lines. That's the key point here, meaning the drawing adapts and fits the perspective as it develops on the page. This would cut him some slack because he can adjust the figure or scene as he goes to make sure every line is actually in the correct perspective. A mistaken line does not need to be erased because he just moves the drawing and mental image around it. I have experienced this for myself at times when copying from reference, where instead of erasing an incorrect line, I just change the figure's angle or facing slightly to make the pose work with what I've drawn. I still have a lot of work to do to get to the level of artists like Tom Fox, but again, if drawing in silhouettes is a skill that you possess, how did you go about learning it? And how much can you pre-visualize an image before putting it down onto paper? Are you able to see the things you draw in your imagination first, or do you develop them line by line on the page, adapting the mental image to fit what your hand has produced? It seems like I get best results when I rough in a drawing, and almost gradually let it emerge from the page, but this is messy when working on paper, and I'm just curious as to what point this ability to draw perfect outlines kicks in. This opens up even further chicken egg questions, like does the hand ever truly do what the brain wants, or does the brain change its visualization based on the hand's errors? We won't get into that today, but it's clear that there is some back and forth in this process while drawing. Another thing that people have suggested to improve proprioception is blind drawing, so I'll try and run an experiment on that at some point in the future as well. Another issue I was contending with last time was that I couldn't really come up with any designs of my own, and the suggestions I've received from this have been truly astounding, from using my dreams to narrating as I draw to tell the story aloud. There are clearly some very imaginative artists watching these videos, so thank you for sharing your insights with me. All of these are great, and highlighted the fact that designing objects, worlds, and characters is really as much about writing, being inspired by things, and telling stories as it is about technical execution, which is something I wasn't paying enough attention to. The things we do in our lives besides drawing should feed into our imaginations and inspire us as artists and designers. To make this easier and more pragmatic though, and more related to pure drawing, I'll share one way that I've begun to think about this so that I can build it up as a skill. Essentially, it's just shape language. Let's say I want to draw a machine like the ones in the video game F-Zero. I know that drawing things in an orthographic view is always a better starting point than jumping straight into perspective, so I'll draw this from a top, front or side view. Cars and vehicles are usually best drawn from the top or side, so I'll pick a top view. I think about the machine as a square, and I play with the proportions and how these make the design feel bulkier, faster or slower, depending on how I change the square's dimensions. I could try another shape, like a triangle, and see how that changes things again. I can also do crazy stuff like use a circle or a square, circle and triangle. It's important to mention that this is a base shape, and that I'm not thinking so much about detail here, but more about proportions and overall character. If I wanted to make a crab mech, it would need to be wide, deep, and probably not too tall, because a crab generally fits inside a box that is shaped like this. This seems to be a pretty solid first step in establishing a design of your own, and from there you can add secondary and tertiary details and bring it into perspective based on your orthographic drawing. It's also fun to draw these boxes and forms around objects or designs you like by other artists, and then try to reverse engineer why they fit inside those proportions. The biggest issue I discovered from my 200-hour repaints was that I cannot render that well, at least from imagination, when dealing with more complex forms. Part of this is not understanding enough about how light works. The new planar aspect of drawing anatomy I have dipped my toes into has opened up a new avenue for exploration, and that's casting shadows. One of the biggest changes for the 200 to 300 hour mark was trying to render everything I drew. This makes me think about the forms even more three-dimensionally, and also to observe shadow shapes and consider how the three-dimensional forms I am placing intersect the light and cast shadows on other body parts, or how the shadows wrap around their forming planes. I experimented with using pencils for this initially, but it took too long to get the values down and it was quite messy. One faster, cleaner way that I've discovered is to use ink wash in a water brush pen. The ink is by Jacques Herbin and it's called Grise Noire. By putting some in the brush's barrel with a bit of water, I can make a wash that works very similarly to marker pens, and it can be made weaker or stronger depending on how much water is added. I first saw this technique done by the artist Paul Heaston, who uses it alongside a fountain pen to produce some really wonderful drawings from life. Another method I like is a paper stump, and I prefer using this on smooth paper, typically drawing with a 2B lead in a mechanical pencil. The cool thing about the stump is it actually holds graphite, so you can quickly place value with it, a lot like using a marker pen. I first saw this used by the artist Eliza Ivanova, who just dabs it in places to very quickly place values and depict form. It's the same exact idea as the water brush, but it creates a different feel. One thing I like about this is that the graphite is quite hard to get even and consistent when adding it with a pencil. It seems to scratch the page or leave very definite marks. The stump applies it very smoothly and consistently. Sometimes I go back in with a pencil to darken areas and create things like the terminators on forms, the line where the shadow is darkest. This allows me to add another value or to create a gradient effect by smudging over this darker area and add even more realism. This helps me, and probably you, to see the drawing as even more three-dimensional, and it's a very fast and easy way to trick the brain into seeing believable forms when drawing. It brings a little more mood and atmosphere into the work for little effort. My hope is that this will help me learn more about how the planes of the anatomy look as I get more into it. Hopefully with this and more digital rendering practice, it will put me in a better position to attempt my repaints again at hour 400. One of the biggest paradigm shifts that has occurred for me when learning to paint in the most recent 100 hours is how painting values really is not so much about capturing reality or even being accurate, but about making sometimes big decisions in a way that tries to benefit the painting. This is something I thought I understood, as in I've read it and heard it a bunch of times and I would claim to be doing it, but something has really clicked somewhere recently, and now I feel like I really appreciate how this works a lot more than I did previously. When we want to paint the shadows under the chin, for example, do we want to paint that shape with every little dent and bulge we see and capture the way the value shifts perfectly? Or do we want to just make it a triangle and then paint it with the same value that we used somewhere else in the painting? There isn't a correct answer to this, but for the work I'm trying to produce and the level I currently find myself at, I feel I get much more appealing and faster results when I stop and ask myself questions like this as I work. This is how simplification takes place. It doesn't just happen when we paint. We have to work out how we are doing it while we do it. If you're a skilled artist, you probably already have this down as a reflex and may not even think about it. But for me as a beginner, I feel like I learn a lot more when I deliberately experiment with this and focus on these decisions while painting or drawing things. And the more I play with it, the more I realize that painting and drawing is literally just decision making. You cannot ever capture reality, so you decide what to include and what to omit, and how these things will be represented. Hopefully, the more I progress, the less brain power I'll have to commit to this decision making, at least for this basic level, and I'll be more able to just free flow and capture the things that interest me. In the meantime, I find myself asking questions like, how can I group these shapes into a bigger, simpler shape? Or can I get away with just painting this entire section in one color? Sometimes when I do this, it was the right decision to make, and the painting looks good. But other times, it was the wrong choice, and the painting looks worse. But that's all part of the learning process. We shouldn't feel upset or ashamed about making mistakes and the wrong decision calls, because this is where the learning takes place. As always, I take notes at the end of every session on a study card, and these notes help inform me for the next time I work on this problem. Another thing related to this is what I call the critical hit ratio, and it highlights something that we all experience no matter where we are on the curve of learning any new skill. When I paint currently, I would estimate that only 1 in 20 of my paintings are really any good, and I'm talking about my little 30 to 60 minute long studies here. You could say my critical hit ratio is 1 in 20. That means I have to produce 19 really quite bad paintings to get to the one good painting where it's still bad compared to a professional, but it's good for me personally. As I get better, this crit ratio will improve, say to 1 in 10. But remember, that's actually still quite a lot of crummy paintings that I'm generally unhappy with for every one good painting I make. Even an absolute top-tier artist like Kim Jung-gi had a ratio, although it may have been something like 999 in 1000. That means that for every 999 good pieces of art that Kim Jung-gi produced, he would have made one that was an anomaly, a bad piece, at least for him. You too have a critical hit ratio, and it can be easy to become discouraged when working through 19 drawings or paintings just to hit that one you feel proud of. The thing is, there's no such thing as a failed piece of art, providing you learn from it. If I make 20 paintings and only one is good, I write down why it came out good, and I do the same for the other 19 and why they were bad. This means every painting is seen as a learning opportunity and a way to grow and push ourselves as artists. Try not to be discouraged as you ride the learning curve, and remember that this crit ratio applies to everyone, and it will always apply to you, and me, and every other artist, no matter how good we ever get. If you're a professional artist watching this, I'd love to know what you think your critical hit ratio is. We rarely show our failed art pieces online because why would we? We want to have a good portfolio. I deliberately share mine in my daily shorts feed so you can see this ratio for yourselves, but how many of your studies are you actually happy with? Another concept that I've been using for this experiment that I haven't covered yet is the idea of a stretch zone. That is, working in an area where you feel uncomfortable and challenged by what is being asked of you. Some of the cards I've been doing now are actually really easy if I just do what the card says. And so I have to find ways to increase the difficulty of the challenge and push myself to test the skill to its limits. The reason for this is that if we get too comfortable at a skill level, we don't grow. I found I was alright at drawing figures with construction lines, so I could nicely plot things before tightening them up, but drawing them as silhouettes, that's still a lot harder. When I first started drawing figures as silhouettes, I struggled, and so I was forced to find ways to perform at this new higher level. Sometimes I overestimate the difficulty of a challenge and I make it too hard, and so I have to find a suitable way to stair-step the difficulty and eventually meet this new skill requirement gradually. For example, can I draw with just 3 construction lines and then draw the rest of the figure as a silhouette? How you create this balance will be specific to you and what you find easy or challenging, but I encourage you to find ways to make your learning more difficult to a point. The reason this works, provided you can find the ideal difficulty level, is something called cognitive load theory, developed by John Sweller. The theory more specifically relates to reducing cognitive load, that is, making things easier to learn when we feel like they overwhelm us, but we can also flip it on its head by increasing a specific aspect of the challenge, something Sweller refers to as the germane load. This helps the skill improve and forces us to engage with it in new ways, increasing our understanding and ability. So when I feel like I can draw pretty well with guidelines and construction, I try drawing without them, using the same knowledge I have of things like the head or perspective in a harder way. This forces me to try and find a way to make this work and get results I'm happy with, leading to a faster skill development than the artist who is never brave enough to venture into the territory where they will undoubtedly produce poor pieces. And producing poor pieces and mistakes is an essential aspect of this skill development. And that's the elephant in the room I want to address here. When you do this, you grow faster, but your work sucks. You are always working at that point where your critical hit ratio favors producing so-called bad pieces. And no, I'm not making excuses here for my own work or anyone else's work being terrible. Making mistakes is learning, period. We learn from the bad art we make. So if you aren't working at a level where this is a likelihood, then perhaps you aren't pushing yourself enough. You can sit and comfortably copy the same anime character or draw your original character day and night, but are you really growing by doing this? How can you make it more difficult? None of us want to make bad work pieces. It's human nature. And when you always choose to work under a moderate cognitive load, you will always feel like you are struggling, and you may feel bad as a result. This is because the work you are doing is always hard. You are in that stretch zone. There is never an easy day of studying, and that's another reason why I only train like this for 1 hour a day. But like the weights in the gym, it needs to be hard for the growth to happen. Over time, we develop amazing skills. It's only when we stop for a second and look back at where we were previously that we can see this growth. So don't be discouraged. Embrace the challenge and experiment to find ways to achieve that next level up in skill. Here's what I traditionally painted and drew for the last 100 hours. This time I'm going to show you the work that I produced digitally as well. I'll try and print these out at some point to add them to the stack, but the total amount of pages is gradually piling up. I think this was another sketchpad this time and half a sketchbook. I tend to go for quantity over quality when I learn things like anatomy. I would rather draw 100 okay drawings of the pelvis in order to wrap my brain around how its form works than do one really perfect study. I find that when trying to engage with new material, this works best for me. It's like I can draw at the same pace as I think and ask myself questions which I can then answer with quickfire drawings. Once I feel a bit more confident, I might spend a bit more time producing something more polished. This is the last video on my progress that I will make this year, and with almost a year since I started using spaced repetition seriously for learning art, I think I've got enough of a feel for it to comfortably describe what I believe it actually does. Do I believe it works? Yes, absolutely, and the combination of repeating exercises regularly and making good notes does seem to make the knowledge you acquire deeper and stronger than most other learning methodologies. But as mentioned before, it's also slow. If you seek a true and thorough understanding of a fundamental artistic concept like perspective or anatomical knowledge, you might consider this as a way to cram it into your brain and make sure it stays there for life. I prefer to have an in-depth knowledge of a subject than a shallow one, and so I like this approach, but it is a long road, and remember that I am also chasing efficiency here. I'll be making attempts to address this in the new year, so you'll see what this entails soon enough. So for the next 100 hours, I will be continuing to learn more detailed anatomy and revisiting a wider range of anatomical drawing approaches, including the Loomis method, to see how they help me to do things like add curvature to my figures. I'll also try and cover more specific anatomy, learning more planes of anatomy to be able to produce them in greater detail and accuracy from imagination. Learning more about colour and light, and trying to pay some more attention to how I render things digitally and traditionally to just try and create more professional looking work. Working more with texture and mark making, especially when painting traditionally, to see how this brings some flair and personality to my work, hopefully something unique to the way I paint things. Last time I also stated I wanted to enhance my visual library, and you will notice that I did not cover that here today. That's because it's being covered by a separate experiment which will be released next year. So that's it for today's video. Hopefully there was something in there that you found interesting and were able to relate to as either a fellow student or as someone who has dealt with this stuff in their formative years as an artist. I'll have one more video this year in December where I'm hoping to announce something special, so I thank you for watching today, and I hope that you can join me next time.